Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Pasture Project webinar entitled How Grass-Fed Can Save the Family Dairy. We are glad to have you with us this morning, and we are glad to be joined by Laura Payne from the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeships. My name is Pete Huff. I'm the Program Officer at the Pasture Project, which is an initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. A quick plug for an upcoming webinar that's happening next week on the 29th of August. This is an evening webinar. Actually, that time is incorrect on my slide. Sorry about that. 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central Time. And that'll be focused on marketing for grass-fed beef and dairy. And we'll be joined by three really great presenters from the Wisconsin Grass-Fed Beef Co-op, as well as Organic Valley, who are going to share some insights around marketing grass-fed beef and dairy. Laura's going to touch on some great points around this as well. So that webinar will be a good follow-on to get some more perspectives on making the most of your marketing efforts to essentially build the value for your products, your grass-fed products. And we'll look forward to having you on that. Just really quickly about the Pasture Project and who we are. The Pasture Project, as I mentioned, is an initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. And we work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest. We do this by working on projects that produce data that can be used to build the case and tie it to field-tested practices for regenerative grazing and other land management and agriculture practices. We try to translate this data and those case studies into resources and decision-making tools that help practitioners make the plans and transition their management practices in a way that's not only environmentally sound, but also economically beneficial and meeting the bottom line for the business. We work with an alliance and a large coalition of individuals who support regenerative grazing, from the nonprofits to government agencies, to individuals and farmers and land managers on the ground. And overall, we're trying to work to shift some of the political, financial, and other systems that operate around in agriculture and livestock to be more supportive of regenerative grazing and grass-based livestock production. You can learn a lot more from our website, pastureproject.org. So really quickly, and probably most importantly, I want to introduce today's presenter. We are very fortunate to be joined by Laura Payne. Laura has been involved in managed grazing education and research in a variety of roles for more than 25 years. And for 8 years, she served as a grazing and organic agriculture specialist for the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, where she helped producers in developing and marketing organic and grass-fed products. She's done grazing research and education at University of Wisconsin-Madison and worked for 7 years as an extension agent in Columbia County. She's currently the program director for Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship, which places aspiring farmers on working dairy farms in 11 states for a 2-year on-the-job training program, a pretty exceptional apprentice program. Laura and her husband raise and direct market grass-fed beef on their 82-acre farm near Columbus, Wisconsin. So she not only teaches it and educates folks on it, but also knows what it means to run the farm on a day-to-day basis. So very glad to have Laura join us today to share some insights on the dairy market, as well as the role for grass-fed dairy in the future of the family dairy. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Laura, and you can share your presentation.
Hello, everyone, and I'm very excited to be here today talking with you. And I hope we have a lot of discussion and questions as we go along. So please do make a note of any questions you have. When the Pasture Project asked me to do this presentation they were looking for information on market development, and I really felt like this was the industry isn't really in a good place for new market development necessarily. Maybe we are, but I really wanted to step back and talk a little bit about the crisis situation that we have in the dairy industry in terms of the low prices and the struggles that our farmers are having getting through this rough time. So the presentation has ended up being kind of a reflection of my thought process on what we as an industry can do, especially in the dairy belt states of the Midwest and Great Lakes states and New England, where we have this deep culture and tradition of family dairy farming, and how we can move ourselves through this crisis period and into a new economically sustainable system. So I have to warn you that there's a lot of material here. I packed a lot of stuff in here. I kind of use a fire hose approach on sharing information. So please do take some notes, and if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, Pete did talk, give a good background on me, so I won't dwell on this, but I will say that my husband and I are not native Wisconsinites. We moved here from Illinois, and I think what I've learned over the last 30 plus years that we lived in Wisconsin is the impact and what the dairy industry can do, not only in terms of economics, but in terms of the rural culture and rural communities in an area. And I think as we look at this deepening dairy crisis we're having, all of the states in the traditional dairy belt have a lot to lose from losing our family dairy farms. So that's what I'm going to try to focus on here. As Pete said, I have recently, 3 years ago, I took a position with the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship, and in a lot of ways, this is my way of looking toward the future and helping train a next generation of dairy farmers that will manage in the lowest cost, most sustainable system as possible. And I'll get back to this at the end and tell you more about that. Okay, so everyone, whether or not you're in the dairy industry, has heard about the crisis that has been going on for several years. And this is just a collection of headlines that I pulled off the internet. And when you see headlines in USA Today in the week and those kinds of publications, you know that this dairy crisis has attracted a lot of attention, and we know that something definitely needs to be done. So how did we get here? This is a chart that shows the price of milk over the last 10 years or so. And, the first thing, if you're not a farmer, the first thing you notice is how could anybody possibly budget for their household, let alone for their business, when you've got the variation that we see here in prices from year to year. I was at the Department of Agriculture in 2009 when we had the lowest prices recorded since for decades, actually. And that was really the kind of the beginning of this crisis that we're in now. The price did come back up over the last several years, but the unique thing right now is the length and the duration of the low prices that we're seeing, and that has been taking a toll on our farmers. A lot of people wonder why this is happening, and I think it goes back to, this is kind of my opinion, but it goes back to the kind of the foundational premise that the dairy industry has looked at for decades, and that is we need to produce more milk. So as our cows have gotten more and more efficient and more productive, and our farms have gotten more productive, around the early 2000s, we began relying more and more on export markets. So we were already producing too much milk, and we were looking to export markets to sell off those excesses. So this graph is kind of complicated and messy, but the blue line here shows the growth in exports of dairy products. And what this points out is, if you look at the orange line, which is the milk price, whenever our exports decline or moderate at all, we see a pretty big price shock in our milk price. So during each of these periods where you see a dip in the export price, we also see a corresponding dip in the milk price. The exports are still growing, but every time some sort of glitch in the market takes place, our prices are especially sensitive to that because we're really in an overproduction situation. And then finally, this last period where we've seen prolonged low prices, this has been associated with a point when the European Union removed their milk quotas. So dairy farmers in the European Union can now produce as much milk as they'd like to. That milk is resulting in declines in exports to Europe. And I'm thinking that that isn't going to change a lot. They're probably not going to reimpose quotas, and we're going to have to deal with losses of export markets. So, and this causes us a problem because dairy farmers have been in a situation where our profits are pretty marginal, and this is all dairy farmers, not just grazing farms or confinement farms. So this graph shows that the green line is our income from operations through the last 12 years or so. The blue line is operating costs, so that's our annual variable costs of operating the farm. And as you can see, we can almost always stay above our operating costs and have more income than the operating costs. However, if you add the allocated costs, which are opportunity costs for unpaid labor, depreciation of machinery and equipment, land rental, other overheads, dairy farmers for a long time have been having trouble making a profit over those added costs. So this crisis that we're in now has been a long time coming. There are other factors that are affecting it as well. You know, the low prices is one, and the overseas production, trade wars, in the production costs almost never go down. They're always going up, and then we can layer over those financial stressors other aspects of the dairy industry, like our aging farming population, the aging infrastructure we have in this region that needs to be updated. And then nationally and globally, in some areas, we're seeing the effects of extreme heat and even water shortages. So the gradual loss of dairy farming has kind of escalated in the last year or two. And this is another headline from this year. Last year, Wisconsin lost more than a dairy farm a day, 1.5 dairy farms a day. And we're seeing that throughout especially the Dairy Belt region of the United States. And I really feel like this is kind of a turning point or a watershed moment in the dairy industry, something like what the pork industry saw. 1998 was my first year in extension, and I remember working with pork producers who saw this crash in their prices. And before that, things were, they were struggling, but things were going along, and there was some hope. And then after that, we saw kind of an escalation in the consolidation and vertical integration in the industry. And I'm hoping that's not what we're seeing now in the dairy industry, but I think we're at a point where we need to look at kind of the bigger picture and how we can influence the direction the dairy industry is going at this critical point. So the dairy industry is going to change. It has been changing for decades. The chart here shows a gradual increase in herd sizes from back in the 1940s to today, and a a pretty steep decline in the number of farms. So we're going to see a lot of changes going forward as well. But I think we have the pieces to put together to preserve and maintain family scale dairy farming, especially if we utilize grazing and organic practices. So I think one of the things, one of the factors that is going to impact us and is already impacting a lot of dairy farmers, that's something that we need to be aware of and maybe be proactive about dealing with, is our relationships with our processors. I want to tell a little story. Back in 2009, I was involved in this big statewide set of listening sessions on sustainability in agriculture. And this brought out a lot of people throughout agriculture, from very small specialty crop farms to big confinement dairies to large commodity grain producers. And we all got together in little groups around the state. And the question was asked, what is your definition of sustainability? So I remember very clearly the head of the Corn Growers Association was in my group, and he said, sustainability is when I have enough money to buy out my neighbor when he goes bankrupt. And the dairy processor who was in the room said, sustainability for us is when we can back a semi up to a milk house and fill it in one stop. And I thought that was pretty surprising that they were even thinking that way. That was 2009. But that's really what has come to pass today. And that's one of the things that is really squeezing our family dairies right now. And this is a neighbor of mine who milks about 2,000 cows, and the milk truck just parks in his milk house. So it's happening. And I think the way that's impacting a lot of dairy farmers, especially here in Wisconsin, but across the dairy belt, is that we're seeing that we no longer have a secure and guaranteed place to go with our milk. This is another story of a processor here in Wisconsin, kind of symbolic of this situation. And it's kind of ironic that this company is called Grasslands, but it's the largest butter manufacturer in the country. They started in 1904, when they probably were a grassland-based company. But this last year, we kind of had a shock, or a wake-up call, as this headline says, when this company kind of summarily dropped 75 dairy farms from their patron pool. And the State Department of Ag and others scurried around to help find a home for those farmers' milk. They gave them a month to do that. But that's something that's I think is going to become more common. The processors are also getting squeezed by the low milk prices. They're looking for ways of cutting their costs, and milk hauling is something that's on the top of their list. So that's going to continue to be an issue. So the question is, where do these changes leave the family dairy? And I've been talking about the dairy belt a couple of times here, and this map just shows the region that we're talking about, which is the traditional, the historic area where dairy farming has historically existed for the most part. In fact, most of dairy farming, in terms of people and expertise and knowledge, still exists in that region. So this is kind of a shocking statistic. In the western states, where in the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a lot of growth in dairy farming, 4,000 farms, 4.3 million cows. If you look at our region in the dairy belt, we have about the same number of cows, 4.2 million. We have 31,000 farms. Totally different structure, totally different culture. And I would argue that the people we have in this region are one of our greatest strengths that we need to capitalize on. This map shows just a reflection of the fact that the processing is following these big dairies. You can see some big processors out in California, the New Mexico-Texas border, where some of those large confinement dairies are, in Idaho, where we have growth of confinement dairies. But we still have a lot of processing in the Northeast and the Midwest. And one of the things that we're seeing is, although we worry a lot about the loss of farms in our region, we are seeing growth in milk production in the upper Midwest and New England. The dark green is the highest growth, light green is lower growth, and then the pink and red are where we've seen declines. And I think the one thing that's interesting about this map is a couple of the areas where we have, where there's been the most growth in large confinement dairies and processing, they're struggling and they're losing production. And this goes back to some of the factors that are affecting the dairy industry, and those include weather conditions and water availability. So those are things that are going to impact further growth in dairy in those regions, and those are things that we actually have some advantages in our region. So we have other advantages as well. Family dairies in our region can have a major impact on a state's ag economy and overall economy. So these are numbers for Wisconsin. 50% of all ag sales are dairy products. 60% of ag production is on dairy farms. 3/4 of agriculture is tied to dairy in our state. And this has an influence across agriculture in terms of the role that forages play in crop rotations, and how breaking up those pest and weed cycles can be supported by adding forages and pasture into cropping systems. And of course, environmentally, perennial crops, including alfalfa, are responsible for carbon storage, improving soil health, protecting water quality, and providing wildlife habitat. So these are all the things that family dairies in our region can support and do contribute to. So what can we offer those dairy farms other than grow, get big, or get out? And I believe that small family dairy farms are a good fit for specialty and artisan processing. And we can think in terms of either selling into premium markets that are developing and growing. We can capture more of the value by considering farmstead processing. And then, of course, we can reduce our cost of production, which is something that all farmers can do, whether or not you have access to or you want to go into farmstead processing. So let's talk a little bit about the economics of grazing dairy. And this is one of the reasons why, for the last 30 years I've worked in this area, because it makes so much more sense to manage in this way. So there are 3 ways to increase your profit. You can increase production, which has been kind of the mantra of the industry as a whole. Got to increase your production per cow, and you got to grow your herd. A more effective way of becoming more profitable is reducing your cost of production, and then you can layer on top of that a premium pay price. So this graph shows some data from Tom Kriegel, who is an ag economist at the University of Wisconsin, who's been collecting data from grazing dairies for 20 years or so, not only in Wisconsin, but across the Great Lakes region. So the graph shows in blue our income per cow, and in red the cost per cow. And on the left here is the confinement dairy, and on the right are the grazing dairies. So basically the take-home message in this chart is that this confinement farm has to raise about 4 times as many cows to make as much profit as this grazing farm. The difference is 4 times as much. So one very effective way that we can make our family scale dairy farms more sustainable and more profitable is by really embracing managed grazing and using it as effectively as we can to reduce our costs. This set of graphs is from a study that it's ongoing right now. We looked at 7 grazing dairies across the upper Midwest, and these are just some snapshots comparing those 7 dairies to a database of several hundred farms in the region. So here in the upper left-hand corner, the average number of cows per farm. Comparatively, most of our grazing dairies are bringing on more cows. They're about 1/3 larger than the confinement or traditional dairies. If you can look at the upper right, we can see that each cow is producing less milk. So we're not pushing our cows. We're not pushing for production per cow as much as the confinement industry is. On the bottom, our take-home messages, average net farm income was 90% higher on our grazing dairies, and the net farm income per hundredweight of milk was 133% greater. So this kind of reinforces what a lot of us have known, that by focusing on reducing cost of production and efficiency of your system, being profitable in a grazing dairy is very likely. And it also is a cushion. So these farms, even with the prices as low as they are and as low as they have been, they're able to continue making a profit year in and year out. Okay, so if we could get more of our dairies, our 31,000 dairies across the region to adopt managed grazing, we could have these kinds of benefits. Wisconsin is hovering around 9,000 farms right now, and over half of the economic activity associated with agriculture is in the dairy sector. And then we have the role of forages and the landscape in terms of environmental and agronomic benefits. So can we transform our dairy industry across the region to take advantage of some of these benefits? I'd like us to think about a little bit about the impact of these farms throughout the region, not just in Wisconsin, in terms of rural communities. And I think this is something that is not really understood or appreciated as well as it could be. But I'd like us to think, how would our rural communities look if instead of 3,000 cow dairies in the region, if we had one 3,000 cow dairy? And I think that could make a big difference in whether we have thriving rural communities and whether we have vibrant local economies and people being attracted to living in rural communities. If you look at the role of dairy farms and how, what role they could play in terms of revitalizing rural communities. There are some significant differences between a dairy farm and any other kinds of farms. And these are some data that I collected from the 2012 Census of Ag. So it's a little bit old, but it gets my point across, I think. If you look across the states of the dairy belt, the green bars are the net income from family dairy farms, and the brown bars are net income from all other types of farming. So as you can see, the dairy farms, one can conclude from this that the dairy farms are able to generate a family living more readily than some of the other types of farms. And then if you look at the spending, this is another, tying into the rural economies and rural communities. Dairy farms, you're milking 300 days a year at least. You use a lot of inputs. Even the grazing dairies are using, are consistently using inputs and services in their local community. And this graph shows dairy farm spending per acre and compared to other farms. So having a dairy farmer in your community is likely to generate a lot more economic activity than having a cash grain farm or another type of farm. In fact, the economists suggest that each dairy cow represents about $34,000 in annual economic activity. And this includes not only the sale of the milk and the production into products, but also the services provided by veterinarians and the people they employ, the feed plants and the people they employ, and all of those other kind of secondary economic activities. The spending of these people who are here in the community to serve the farmers, their spending also is included in that. So a dairy farm can have a huge impact on a rural community, and I think that the landscape of our region with many small dairy farms is supportive of the rural communities in the states where there are family scale dairy farms. So if the dairy belt loses its base of dairy farms, I think we'll lose a lot. And I think that some of the things that are as important as the economics are the social and environmental pieces that will lose if we lose more family dairies. So the question is, can we drive market growth for grass dairy or can the market drive growth of grass dairy as it has for grass-fed beef? Several of the other webinars in the series are dealing with grass-fed beef, which has really taken off. This graph just shows the growth. This is for beef sales, but as you can see, organic and non-organic grass-fed beef has really taken off in the market and has spurred an increase in production here in the United States. And it's also spurred a lot of imports, unfortunately. So as a market grows, as a niche market like this grows and becomes more mature, we think about when about 5% of the market is this niche of grass-fed, then the big players get interested and get involved. So this is what's happened with the beef industry. We're seeing double-digit growth per year in sales, and now the big beef packers are involved, and they're driving a lot of imports. There's some positives and negatives to that, but the question is, can we do the same thing for grass-based dairy? It's not quite there yet, and I thought it kind of would be, and there are maybe some reasons why it hasn't gotten there yet that we'll talk about a little later. So back when I was doing more market development research, there was a lot of interest in grass-fed, and this is an older survey. But what I find interesting is that of all of the questions asked, what benefits are you looking for when you buy grass-fed? The one that has really taken off and become the driver of sales was not even asked then, and that is the healthy fats question. Increased omega-3s, vitamin A and E, CLA. That wasn't even on the radar screen back then. So we really, we kind of can't tell what's going to happen and what the market is going to do. But I think the health benefits in the beef sector have really contributed to the strength of the growth in that sector. And as you can see, a lot of the ads here, this is just an example, really talking about health benefits and targeting family, young families with children, what those families are buying, and trying to influence that demographic. I think the real place where adding value could be stronger and could generate more income for farmers is not in the kind of the family shopping arena, but in the premium market. And it's the steaks and the high value cuts that are going to generate the profits we need to spur the growth in the meat industry and on the grass-fed dairy side. So right now, the dairy side is very much focused on health issues, and generally, historically, only about 25% of the population respond to health claims and purchase products based on health factors. And I think that's something else that's changing now. And I think the organic and grass-fed markets are really right now being driven primarily by the healthy fats movement, if you want to call it that. It's also being driven by product choices, and this graph in the background just shows different products and their growth over time. And the one that really stands out is this red line, which is yogurt, which is also part of this healthy foods trend, which yogurt is just completely taking off with unprecedented growth. And a lot of the grass-based dairy products that are doing well on the market are yogurts. The other growing market, though, that I'd like to talk about a little bit more in the next few slides is this other cheese area, because I think the grass-fed can be much more than catering to a health market, and it needs to have a breadth of benefits to offer the consumer. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about our some research that we did at the Department of Ag back in the late 2000s and early 2010s that really looked at the difference in the milk and the product and how we can capitalize on those differences. So the product involved farmers, grazing farmers. It involved some processors and cheesemakers. Wisconsin has a very active dairy food research department, and we used some of those researchers for that. And then we had a couple of chefs that worked with us, and they provided the most interesting assessment of these products. So we looked at, we actually collected milk and compared side-by-side products, conventional and grass-fed, that were made by the researchers at the university. So we looked at whole milk, cream, butter, yogurt, and cheeses. We also looked at some seasonal variations. When you have a pastured product, you're going to get changes in the pasture over the seasons, and then you've also got winter, of course. So this was probably one of the funnest projects I've ever worked on. So the way it worked was that we collected the milk, made these products, the chefs worked with them and used them in recipes, and then we got to taste them, and that was really fun. But the thing was really remarkable was the difference. On the left side of your screen, you see a vat of grazing milk and a vat of conventional milk, and you can see even the visual appearance is different. You can see the yellow from the beta carotenes from the fresh pasture in that milk. It had a different aroma. And when they made it into products, it tasted very, very different, and it behaved differently. These are just some of the comments that were made when we share these products with the public and what their comments were. This publication in the back is one that we provided you as a PDF, and it has the results of the study. On one other thing, I put this little ear of corn here to remind myself that this was not 100% grass-fed milk. It was all of these farms supplemented with, a small amount of grain, and some of the marketers actually felt that the grain enhanced the flavor of their products. So there isn't a requirement for 100% grass-fed to have these flavor differences. So we also made a little video of this project, and it has some of the farmers and has the processors and the chefs talking about what we learned. It's a little bit long, so I'm not going to show it to you today. It's about 12 minutes, but there's the URL if you'd like to take a look at it on YouTube. I think the most amazing thing about this project was the behavior of the fats in the butter. So in baking, in preparation of desserts, the chef said that when they make a frosting like this, the butter behaved differently and it imparted unique flavors. It baked and browned differently when it was used in something like a shortbread. And then when it was used in some of these savory dishes, like this is a fish dish, it enhanced the other flavors. If you've got spices and herbs, and that just kind of brought out all of those flavors in a way that was very unique. And every time somebody tasted them, they would say so. I think this is it was really an amazing project, and I think the products that we can get from grass-fed dairy are amazing, and just for their taste alone, and not even for the health benefits and the organic and the animal welfare, and all of those things are important. But I think we could capitalize on this notion of terroir, that what makes this milk unique is the soils, the plants, and the animals, and the unique flavors that are imparted to the milk from this place where we raise our cows. And the notion of terroir is most commonly used in the context of wine, but European cheesemakers know this, and they use this themselves in their products very effectively. And I think we can do the same here. And this is what Wisconsin has been working on for a number of years, and I think it's something that that we could, throughout the region where we've got the history and culture of dairy farming and dairy processing, we could make this an economic driver of the dairy industry and keep our family dairies in business. So back when I was at the Department of Ag, we had a long-standing project that ended when the current administration came in. but it had been very successful, and it took an active role in helping kind of build this craft dairy industry. So today we have a master cheesemaker program. We have 600 types of cheeses made here. 46%, almost half of the specialty cheese production in the U.S. And a lot of the marketing is emphasizing local, the family farms, kind of this connection to the land. And this is where a lot of people think the food industry is going and needs to go. This is a quote here at the bottom from the head of a big food distribution company. Food is no longer about fast, convenient, and cheap. It's about memory, romance, and trust. So people are wanting to connect with their food, not just for health benefits, but also to have this sense of place and to know the farmers that are producing the food for them. So the next few slides, I'm just going to give you some examples of how that's being done here in Wisconsin. These are the ones I know about. I know there are other types of farmstead and small cooperative efforts going on throughout the region, but these are the ones that I know. So we'll talk about them briefly. So this is actually a neighbor of mine. They live about 2 miles down the road. Their marketing is very much focused on the family. So they have a Farmstead creamery. You can go in and get an ice cream cone. They have lots of events. They bring their customers out so they get to know them and be able to be on the farm and see the cows. That's a very effective strategy for creating that memory, a food experience. Romance. So the story behind the food. This is Saxon Homestead Creamery, which is in eastern Wisconsin, a farm that's been a dairy for more than 6 generations. They've had 3 creameries or 3 cheese factories on their land, and they just launched this last one in the last 10 years or so. So they make these high-value specialty cheeses that are command a premium price in the market. But they have this story to tell that is associated with the cheese. And then finally, my third example is probably one of the biggest success stories in farmstead cheese making, maybe in the country. This is Mike Gingrich. It's a partnership between 2 farms. Mike went to Europe and studied with French cheesemakers, looking for his own unique recipe of alpine cheeses. And their Pleasant Ridge Reserve cheese has won more Grand Champion awards at the American Cheese Society than any other cheese. This markets for about $30 to $40 a pound. So again, this is targeting a very different demographic than the first one that's really targeting a family dairy. So all 3 of these were farmstead creameries, and one of the things that I think is very important to moving our dairy industry forward is that not everybody has what it takes or wants to get involved in marketing their own products. So we need to build some structures so that dairy farmers can work together to pool their milk and to provide this premium product to the marketplace and gain a premium for it. And, an example in the beef industry was the Wisconsin Grass-Fed Beef Co-op, which I helped start when I was at the Department of Ag, that has really taken off due to some really good management by the farmers and staff there. So they're a success story in the marketplace that I would like to see duplicated in the dairy industry. On the dairy side, a lot of the small co-ops that started about the same time have really struggled. So this was the other publication I shared with you of these creameries that we have case histories of in there. Only 2 of them are still in existence. So that's where some of the pitfalls and challenges come in, and the next few minutes we'll just talk about some of those. And they're all, they're not insurmountable, but they do require some careful strategies going forward. So going back to Sassy Cow here, one of the challenges we have in the dairy industry is that our cows produce milk every day of the year. If we're seasonal, they may not produce it in the winter, but there's not a way of storing the product on the hoof like there is for beef. So we need to have an outlet. We need to either sell the fluid milk, or we need to make the milk into a product that can be stored. So that brings you to your product choices. And this particular farm has been successful selling fluid milk, but fluid milk is probably one of the riskiest products to sell, because it's very perishable, obviously, and it's very price sensitive. It's a staple. People are going to be purchasing it week in and week out. If their budget is squeezed, they're not going to buy our premium product. They're going to make sure they get the milk on the table for their kids. So fluid milk is a challenge. This farm, with its marketing to families, and they've been very successful in getting into grocery stores in the region, they're making milk work, but that's not necessarily our best product option. The other challenge that I've seen with a lot of these startups is how to transition into making your own products and out of selling to your processor. So when you first start, you're not going to have an immediate market for all of your milk. So where are you going to go with your milk? And especially in this atmosphere that we have of processing or processors that are looking for opportunities to drop family scale farms, you may not be able to find a processor that's willing to take only part of your milk. This farm actually has 2 separate dairies. One of them is an organic farm, and the other one is a large confinement dairy. So they have been able to, because they're a large confinement dairy, their processor is willing to keep them on, and they'll take whatever milk they don't use in their own processing. So that's, for them, it works really well. But not everybody has that option. Okay, some other issues that we ran into looking at these case studies was when you've got a small co-op, you may have some inconsistency in the milk quality among farms, and that can result in changing quality of your product. And when you go out and sell to a grocery store or a restaurant, they're not necessarily going to be willing to deal with the inconsistency that your product has. There's also seasonal inconsistency. So if we're marketing a grass-based product, it's going to be different in the summer when the cattle are out on pasture than in the winter when you're producing stored feeds. So a couple of these pictures, I know you can't see this very well, but these are 3 different butters from a company here in Wisconsin, and this one on the right is called the summer butter. So the summer, you can see the summer butter has the beta carotene in it. It's more yellow, and it's sold as a special product. Maybe it's only available in the summer, and that's another way of attracting consumer attention and interest. Is, I've got to buy this now because it's only available during this short period. The Uplands cheese folks started with their Pleasant Ridge Reserve, which is made only in the summer when the cattle are on pasture, and then they actually produced a whole different product to sell in the winter, which is this on the left, this Rush Creek Reserve, which is a brie type cheese. So that's how they dealt with their seasonal inconsistency. Okay, and then finally, a couple of more logistical issues for our dairy farms. So if we want to support family dairies and building this grass-fed dairy industry, we need to address keeping our farms in business and sizing those farms so that they're profitable and that they're still attractive to the milk, to the processors, so they'll come and pick up their milk. I think what's going to happen is that the longer the route gets and the more small farms these processors have to pick up from, they're either going to pass those costs along to the farmers or they're going to drop farms. And I think that, maybe one thing that we need to be thinking about is can we build cohorts of grazing dairies and take the milk hauling on take control of the milk hauling. So we've got the product and the processor comes to us for it. So I don't know if that's feasible, but I see right now the processors are using this hauling issue to really make some decisions for the industry in terms of how many family scale dairies are going to get picked up. So those are big issues for us. And then finally, it's very costly and time-consuming to do your own processing and to build that from scratch. So can we find partners in the processing industry who are interested in this product and understand the value of the unique flavors we have and the unique properties it has? And this is just one example of a cheesemaker here in Wisconsin, Bob Wills, who has helped launch a number of these value-added specialty cheesemakers by opening his cheese plant to them and helping them develop recipes and helping them develop their technique and help them launch their products. So we need to find more people like Bob Wills out there to work with. And then finally, the other factor in making this this market and this industry based on grass-fed work is proximity to markets. And this map is just a population map, but it illustrates very clearly that we are in an area that is close to where the markets are. And I think from all the work that we've done, many of the products that we looked at, we could characterize the markets as either this organic natural foods type of buyer who's motivated by health concerns and environmental concerns. And then there's another whole class of shoppers that I don't think we're really tapping into very well, who are kind of artisan shoppers. They're foodie type people. Flavor and quality is important. The uniqueness and the story behind the product is important. And a lot of these folks are the more affluent, well-educated consumers who have the money to be able to purchase these high-value products, and that's what's going to return more profit to our processors and our farmers. Okay, and then finally, how are we doing for time? Okay, I'll wrap up here pretty quick. I have a few more slides, but it looks like we need to set aside a little time for questions. I just want to end with a couple of slides about dairy grazing apprenticeship and the fact that we really need to, as we're thinking about all of these other market possibilities, we need to also think about how we are going to transition all of these family dairies. So we have, as I said before, we have a lot of farms and a lot of cows, and we need to think in terms of transitioning some of these farms into the next generation. Many of our dairy farmers do not have a successor. This is a study, it's kind of an old study, but the punchline is 60% of the farmers did not have a successor. And that's kind of where the dairy grazing apprenticeship got its start with the idea that we can no longer count on the skills and the knowledge to be passed on within a family, that we need an apprenticeship tradition for our skilled trade. Because as we know, back when the country was founded, 90% of the population was farming. Today, it's less than 1%. And apprenticeship is an up-and-coming topic that is being discussed across the all industries and in political circles as a means of providing jobs for people. We only have one apprenticeship program in commodity scale farming, and that's dairy grazing apprenticeship. So we'd like to encourage others to build apprenticeship programs to help train people who are not in the dairy industry to get interested in coming into the dairy industry. So our program is 2 years, 4,000 hours, 9/10 of that is on the farm paid work-based training, and then there are some classes that are taken. I'll just skip through these slides. We're currently in 11 states, and as you can see, we're kind of across this dairy belt region where we have focused intentionally on the area where we have a lot of skilled people with a lot of knowledge to share and pass on to the next generation. And we have worked, we've developed partnerships with a number of organizations in these states to help move the program forward and to have local people on the ground to help deliver it. I'm going to skip over that and get to this slide, which is a map of showing where our masters and apprentices and apprentice candidates are. So we have over 300 people who have applied on our website to become apprentices, and about 160 master grazers as you can see, these blue dots. So we'd like to think about that network of farmers as maybe a foundation for some of this development beyond training the next generation. Maybe thinking of this as a hub for development or kind of support of the farming community, the dairy community, and the dairy industry in the region. So can we work with our masters and train multiple apprentices, and then have those apprentices train other apprentices, and kind of build this network that can not only work with each other to do training, but also maybe purchase supplies and services cooperatively, share information, network among the farms across the region. We can do research together. We can build markets together. Maybe we can transfer land and look at financing. So all of these things that can not only create economic activity and keep our farms profitable, but also support local communities. So we'd like to expand what we're doing, and we're working, obviously our core work is peer learning and this transferring knowledge from one generation to the next. But what else can we do with this network? Can we help build a cooperative effort to bring grass-fed products to the market and return a premium to the farmers in the region? Can we help support grass-based dairy farms and family dairies in the region? So that's our question. We don't know what the answer is now, but that's what we're working on. So with that, I'll wrap up. That was my last slide.
Great. Thanks, Laura. We'll just switch back to our main presentation and open it up for questions. Wanted to say thank you again for that presentation. A lot of really great information, a lot of really great content. And we do have some time now to take some questions. So again, to give folks a little bit of time to get those typed in and formulated, again, you're going to use the control panel that is on your screen to use the drop-down menu for questions, and you can enter those in, and we'll take them in order, and Laura can respond to them as they come in. So first question, Laura, is a question around some of the bigger working with, or the potential to work with some of the bigger confined operations, dairy operations. And this particular individual is curious if you had some recommendations or considerations for how they could be included and potentially transition some of their practices to incorporate more grass-based management, or help to contribute more to the local economy, given that they might already be invested in some pretty serious large-scale infrastructure. Do you have any suggestions about how to involve them in thinking about the future of dairy in the region?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways that can be done is to look at their heifer rearing. We have a couple of farms, several large confinement dairies that are looking at, or have already started putting their heifers out on pasture. There's a lot of evidence and data that shows that heifers that are raised on pasture, they cost less, they end up healthier, they have better feet and legs because they've actually gotten some exercise as they were growing. And there's one study that shows that they actually produce more milk in their first lactation as they join the milking string. So we have one really great success story in Northeast Wisconsin. One of our NRCS folks is working very gradually and quietly with individual confinement dairies to help them start thinking about pasturing their heifers. We also have, so he's got maybe 6 or 8 that have started doing this, and once a confinement dairy can go to their neighbor or their peer and see that they're doing it and it's working, that can help really grow that kind of movement. We also have a number of custom heifer raisers here in the state, and I know there are some in other areas as well, who use pasture, who pasture the cattle, and they're also seeing big successes in because they can actually, in some cases, they can produce the heifers for less cost than the confinement dairy would have raising them themselves.
Great, thanks for that answer. Another question that we have is around some of you mentioned a little bit about the marketing, and particularly focused on grass milk and a few other approaches to highlight some of the health benefits. This question is more around your insights or suggestions when it comes to marketing grass-based dairy, grass-fed dairy, in comparison to something like a dairy or milk alternative, so like an almond milk or something like that, since those seem to be increasingly popular. Do you have any thoughts on how to maybe make that distinction and change people's perspective on milk, dairy milk?
That's a good question. It's a complicated. The argument for it is probably more complicated than you could put on a label. But I think one of the keys is this the health aspects of the fatty acids in dairy products have a unique profile that people have found have been related to health aspects. So I think that's one thing. And then the other piece is this whole notion that livestock have a critical role to play in the agricultural landscape because of the forages associated with them and the perennial pastures, and those, from the environmental perspective, I think a landscape, this landscape without livestock would have some very serious environmental consequences because of the role of the forages in the pastures. I don't know how you put that on a label. But so I don't know if there are good easy solutions to that question, but I know it's something that's being dealt with on a lot of different levels. Here in Wisconsin, our state or our senator is looking at this whole idea of restricting the use of the word milk on labels of products that aren't actually dairy products. So that may be another way of addressing that.
Great. It's always a tricky thing. What gets called milk and what actually is. So another question here. This one's a little bit of a longer one, but it's coming from a DGA apprentice, so very on topic. And the question is that this individual is halfway through their program and is currently buying pregnant heifers, keeping all heifer calves, and my masters replace in my calves, maybe replacement calves that were bulls. We milk 55 cows and graze, stay outside all year, and I've felt that having a beef herd to follow the milk cows around on grass could positively impact our farm biology and income. Would this be a good integration for helping with my poor milk price? So I guess the question is, could doing both grass-fed dairy and grass-fed beef in rotation be one way to kind of help bridge the gap in some of these downturns in prices?
It's a good question. Definitely a good question. I think the most, if you look at research about diversification of farms, the most profitable farms over the long term tend to be the ones that have multiple products and can, when the price of one thing is down, the price of another is up. So it's, as a strategy for profitability, I think diversification is always good. The question becomes, do you have the time and the labor available to add enterprises to your operation? And do you have the knowledge and the wherewithal to, especially if you're going to be marketing grass-fed beef, say, to build a successful enterprise? So I think it's definitely possible, and beef seems to be it could be a logical fit. I know a number of dairy grazers who have built successful parallel markets, raising their bull calves on pasture and selling them directly. A dairy bull calf is going to finish differently than a beef bull calf, so your market is not going to be quite the same, and you'd probably do better direct marketing, but that's definitely possible. A good business plan is probably the first step.
Absolutely. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, certainly a lot of considerations in managing two different enterprises or more side by side. We have a couple minutes left here, so just wanted to put in one more question for you before we transition. This one is asking, what have you found to be effective in discussing some of the strategies you've highlighted with university educators or ag economists?
I think the most effective thing to do with anyone who's skeptical of the effectiveness of this system is to take them out on a farm. And we've done a lot of pasture walks where we've invited university folks. Sometimes they're not going to just voluntarily attend a pasture walk, but create that personal relationship and make it feel non-threatening. And, if you take people out and have them talk to the farmers who are doing this, a lot of times it makes a lot more sense to them. We just had a pasture walk here in southern Wisconsin where the daughter of the farmer brought 5 of her colleagues from the Farm Credit Institution to the farm, and some of them had never been on a grazing dairy before. And so these loan officers were seeing how this actually works on the ground, and they could talk to this farmer who had been profitable for 25 years using this system, and that can make a huge difference. It's
Absolutely.
one person at a time.
Absolutely. And maybe just to just follow on that, to fit in one last question that builds off that, would you say that that's a good starting point for someone who might be selling into commodity markets or might not be based on grass? If they're thinking about transitioning their operation, is a good starting point to spend some time with someone who might be on grass-based production, or what might be another first step for someone who might be transitioning an existing commodity feed operation?
Well, going out and visiting farms, and not just one, but to talk to as many people who are doing this and seeing their farms and how they've set them up, because each one is different and there's a lot of decisions to make. Attending pasture walks is a great way to do this, and this is an opportunity for me to give a plug for, at least in our region here. The organization Grassworks is a farmer-run grazing organization that has a calendar with pasture walks all over the state of Wisconsin that you can see. I know there are other organizations in other states that also have pasture walks, Sustainable Farming Association in Minnesota. But if you do some searches and get connected into these communities that are out there, they're not always supported by the universities and the extension. Some of them are, but in almost every state, farmers are getting together and sharing their knowledge about grazing, and there are ways to hook into that community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura, for the great presentation and for responding to all those questions. If you want more information about anything you heard about or about the Pasture Project or DGA, there's some contact information there for myself, Pete, at the Pasture Project, and also for Laura if you would like to reach out and learn a little bit more about some of the topics or resources that she mentioned. You can also, again, check out this webinar recording at pastureproject.org/events, or you can look on YouTube and find the Pasture Project. We'll post it there as well. And if you do want a copy of the presentation, you can email me directly, and I'd be more than happy to send you a PDF version of it.